Better podcast. I'm your host, Shelby, and this is a new format because I'm able to record live on Riverside. I had been using Spotify podcasting before, and to record an audio through their app, I was only able to do 30 minutes of audio. And I know this episode I'm going to go over, so I've decided to take the leap and join the video recording over on Riverside and see how it goes. So we will see. Apparently the quality is supposed to be really good, and it would eliminate me having to upload separately to YouTube another way or yada yada, things that aren't important right now. Anywho, today's podcast episode is a very exciting one and one that I am very nerdy about. And I don't know exactly how this came to mind, but basically I'd mentioned in my previous recording that I was looking to do more brand style informative episodes. And I don't know what hit me today, but I decided to just go ahead and upload a podcast related to branding and product advice that I have for a specific brand, a specific company that I have no affiliation to and quite literally no knowledge of. But as an armchair executive, as I'm going to call myself for these episodes, kind of like Dak Shepard does with his armchair expert episodes, I'm going to just give you the gist of what the brand's all about, what their history has been, whether they're new or they need a rebrand or they've been out of commission for a long time, they're coming back, whatever the case may be. I have some ideas of how they can win in their market. So let's get right into it. Today's episode is all about Barnes & Noble. Super exciting. So I have gone to Barnes & Noble most of my life. And if you remember even longer before that, there was also Borders. And in terms of the market share of this business, I'm not too familiar, honestly. But I do know that Amazon currently has about 50% of the market share of all books sold in the US, which is a huge amount. So they definitely have somewhat of a monopoly over this business and over this market in the US. But I see some opportunity with Barnes & Noble, and here's what I think about it. Barnes & Noble is what I would like to call a legacy brand. And unfortunately, I don't think they've been able to harness that publicly in the way that I would have hoped. But I had a few initial ideas, and I dug deeper into their business and how I think that they can continue to expand. And interestingly enough, they have grown over the past year in 2023, as I was looking at some of their financial statements, and I found a very key ideas that I had thought and were in line with what they're currently doing. So it sounds like they're already starting to modernize their business. I've seen some recent new logos from them, which I have some ideas on, but I thought I would share what I learned about Barnes & Noble thus far, in case anyone is interested. This is extremely nerdy, I will let you know, but it's the kind of nerdy shit that I love. So let's get into it. Okay, so the macro insight about Barnes & Noble is, or rather, let's even take a step back. The entire publishing industry, which again, I'm not familiar with, but I just thought I would do some research while I'm on the topic. And between the years of 2005 and 2021, print publishing industry saw a decline of over $68 billion in revenue. And that came from Statista. I'm sure that is no surprise for many of us, but I thought I would go ahead and share that frame to at least bolster us in where this business is at large within publishing. And I also did a little bit of research on their margins as well in the publishing industry, which tends to be around 10 to 15% of the actual unit price. And then when we go into actual bookstores, it's more like 2 to 5%. So very small margins, but I do think that there is opportunity to capitalize on more than just the books sold inside of a business like Barnes & Noble, and here's why. Reading is always in style to some extent, but I do think with the advent of book talk over the past several years, we've seen a boom in the interest of books in the Gen Z category, even more so over the past couple of years. And I can directionally point to this because according to my favorite source, which is NPD, I use NPD all the time, and I'm a NPD obsessed fangirl. Maybe they're only one, but the best-selling book of 2022, I'm sure you can guess, it was It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, which sold over 2.7 million copies. So that tells me that book talk is highly influential in this space, and there's more to come. there's going to be the next Twilight or Harry Potter or whatever the next series is that is going to completely blow these numbers out of the water. And we also know that this business has been impacted by other tech resources in the publishing space, like ebooks and audiobooks as well. So I am going to touch on my thoughts on that. But net, when it comes to Barnes & Noble is best known for selling books, and I'm going to dive deep about how they can go ahead and do that. So in 2023, Barnes & Noble's fiscal year retail sales increased by $52 million, or a 4% uplift compared to the previous period and previous year. So this was widely contributed by their BNC First Day model, which is something I did not know about, but I thought I would give some context to, and general merchandise sales, which I would have to guess would be widely distributed by just the print publications that they have inside of their brick and mortar stores. But the BNC First Day model I thought was incredibly interesting, and I'll unpack why I think that is in just a few minutes. But their First Day model is something that, as far as I'm aware, I don't know if Amazon necessarily has this, or at least they don't have the same structure at Amazon. So this is one way that they can leverage their core competency and target a specific audience and bring in that new Gen Z group of people who are obviously going to be buying a lot of books. Either it's because they're interested in, whatever's going on in pop culture, or they also are going to school. And the BNC First Day model is Barnes & Noble's college inclusive access model, where digital course materials are included at a rate as an additional course charge for a particular course or program. So basically, we know that if there are students attending a university, the books end up costing quite a lot, and it's something that as a student you should definitely consider. But what Barnes & Noble has done is basically aggregated the dollar amount of these books and provided them as part of the course charge in tandem with, I believe, different universities and whatnot, which I think is super interesting. I'm going to be recommending that Barnes & Noble dive even deeper into a younger audience, and this is how I think that they're going to do it. I read an interesting article on Barnes & Noble after I had thought of this, because I genuinely want to see Barnes & Noble win. I think that they have an interesting model of business, and they have a very specific niche that I'm not sure has been leveraged as efficiently as possible. And they brought in James Daunt as their CEO in 2019 when they had been acquired by a company called Elliott's, which I believe is out of the UK, and Elliott's is owns Waterstones bookstores. And if you've ever been to the UK, Waterstones is a super cool chain. I find Waterstones to be a little bit more mom and pop in feel than Barnes & Noble. I want to go back to one of my favorite movies of all time, which is You've Got Mail. And in You've Got Mail, if you haven't seen it, go see it. It's incredible. And it's another Tom Hanks movie, talking all about Tom Hanks this week. But basically, Tom Hanks is a Nepo baby, and he owns the Fox and Sons bookstores around the U.S. So that's basically like your Barnes & Noble. And then we have Kathleen Kelly, who owns the Little Shop Around the Corner, bookstore that's in the Upper West Side of New York, and it's in like the early 2000s, late 90s. And basically this was when Barnes & Noble like chains were starting to eat away at the market share of the smaller bookstores, which we know continues to be true. And I must say that I definitely recommend that if you do have a local bookstore that you'd like to support, I would love to see that. That's amazing. But I do have some ideas of how Barnes & Noble can continue to leverage themselves as a point of nostalgia in our culture. It's not something I've seen them do. So they brought in James Daunt, who had been a British businessman, and he was the founder of Daunt Books chain. He had been promoted after he had been so successful in his own endeavor in Daunt Books. So he had his own chain of bookstores in the UK, and he was promoted and hired by Waterstones, so the other chain that's the equivalent of Barnes & Noble in the UK, in May of 2011 to turn around their business, because they had seen him do that with his own bookstore chain. Obviously, there's a lot more space to play in when you work for a corporate company, so I'm sure that was something that was interesting to him. He also then became, in 2019, the CEO of Barnes & Noble. So now he's the CEO and managing director of the bookshop chain Waterstones in the UK, as well as Barnes & Noble, which is its equivalent in the US. So I think that's interesting to start off with. So two equivalent conglomerates in two different markets, and he was able to bring them together and create some type of cohesion and grow market share. So he's also known as the man who saved Waterstones. So I believe this is why they brought him into Barnes & Noble, to hopefully do the same in the US, where the business has been very hard hit by Amazon, if not wiped out nearly completely. So I wanted to go through the business of Barnes & Noble as a bit of a case study through the 4 P's of marketing. And this is something that I always share with other colleagues or people that I'm managing or summer interns, to look through marketing through a very clear funnel. And that is, first and foremost, product. So what's the function, packaging, and service that you offer? So for Barnes & Noble, I'll go through what that is. Price, which is cost discounts or margin. Promotion, which includes advertising, sales, and publicity. And then place, which is distribution, logistics, and channel. So I'll go through all 4 of those as it relates to Barnes & Noble, and then finally get to their target market, which will ultimately drive sales and increase their profits. So let's look at product first and foremost, which is where Amazon does not win. So Barnes & Noble has a special place in a lot of people's hearts, I believe. At least I have it myself. And I know that You've Got Mail is a really nostalgic movie and has a nostalgic premise for many people. It was actually, I believe, created on a book that was called The Shop Around the Corner, which was the shop that Kathleen Kelly or Meg Ryan had owned in that movie. So my recommendation and suggestion to Barnes & Noble is to first and foremost be in on the joke. And that is that they have a specific identity within our culture that actually has quite a positive sentiment, and many people have gone into a Barnes & Noble for different reasons and who have very specific memories of being there and why they were there. So whether it was your mother taking you as a little girl or as a little kid to go pick out different books at Barnes & Noble, or getting a gift card at Christmas time and getting to pick out your own books. I know that there's a niche audience of people who have found themselves crying at Barnes & Noble. I'm not really sure why, but I'm sure that's something that we can dig into on TikTok even further. I just feel like if you haven't cried in a Barnes & Noble, what are you doing? You found yourself feeling a little lost, and you need to get immersed in all the books that are there and just spend a bunch of hours. So being at a Barnes & Noble generally means a few things. So it means you're having you're exploring, you're having some kind of treasure hunt experience, hopefully. I think a lot of people still like to go into a Barnes & Noble or a bookstore in general because they want to get lost in the books and they want something to excite them and surprise them. What better experience as a consumer than to be pleasantly surprised by the experience that you have in a store? I know for me, I find that it gets less and less exciting if it's just the same old. There's got to be some sort of newness to tie me into a store or a brand. And another point that I have as well is that I do think that Barnes & Noble can take a book out of Waterstones' product model, and that is that Waterstones has a little bit of a smaller footprint. Obviously, being in Europe, I think that's just more of a commonality there. Barnes & Nobles are generally very huge. There are several levels, which I don't think is something that they necessarily need to minimize by any means, but there's a coziness that's part of Waterstones. And what I like about Waterstones as well is that they generally only carry the best of the best books, so the ones that make it to I believe it's the Sunday Times bestseller list in the UK, which is equivalent to our New York Times bestseller list. And they also have the UK publishers that are not found in the US, which to me as a consumer in both markets, I want to find different books that are only at Waterstones or only at Barnes & Noble. So I'll get into their strategy a little bit later on distribution, but I would say that's one way that they can incorporate the two in the US. I also find that Barnes & Noble has a white space opportunity, and I'm not quite sure if I'm seeing that from them. Although when I did do some research, I think that they're getting there, but their message just hasn't been amplified, and they're therefore not targeting the right people. Because if we could target the people that are on Book Talk who are being evangelical about what they feel about the books, we could drive that traffic into the store, but it's just not happening. So let's see how we can do that. Barnes & Noble has a opportunity to be a part of the common vernacular once again. They absolutely have that opportunity, and part of that is going to be different CSR initiatives that they have and their ownership as a brand of the for the people style brand and bookstore in 2024 in today's day. This isn't necessarily something I've seen them do. I think, unfortunately, they haven't really championed that idea all that much because, as we know, most people now generally use Amazon, yes, and I, too, am an Amazon consumer, but they don't really believe that the practices that Amazon has are necessarily in line with their own values, and I think that's where Barnes & Noble can win. When I looked into their initiative with the universities and aggregating the book sales together to make it more affordable and inclusive for university students to have access to books and publications, I thought that was so interesting, but I didn't know about it. And maybe that's because I'm not a student anymore, but I feel like they should be doing things in the community to help leverage themselves as a company that's for the better good of our population. They also need to have an element of personalization and localization within their product strategy. So how can you curate book selections for a consumer outside of just Goodreads? Because Goodreads is owned by Amazon, of course, so Amazon has really capitalized on a lot of those smaller businesses that funnel back into the publishing industry. So how can Barnes & Noble personalize and curate in a better way? And I have some ideas about that, but I don't think I've seen that from them. I want to go on their platform and be treated as an individual, and I want expert book recommendations. I want there to be spotlights on my favorite authors. I want there to be exclusive only events at their stores. I want things that are big, emotional, and draw me in. And this leads me into my next topic, which is Barnes & Noble having a nostalgic element to them. They own that, and that's not something that Amazon has, unfortunately. That's just not their beat. But Barnes & Noble is able to be that bookstore that, at a larger scale, is nostalgic. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, I always loved going to Barnes & Noble. Now, granted, we didn't always buy books from Barnes & Noble because of the cost, but it was always exciting to just find yourself lost in a Barnes & Noble and spend way too long in there and read a book a little bit too long than you should have. But I think that Barnes & Noble can actually make this message known to increase foot traffic. I almost want to call it the Get Lost campaign that Barnes & Noble can stream in different non-traditional media outlets, because it appears that that message just is not getting to the right people, which is a younger audience that they have yet to tap into. So what does that look like? Does that mean that they just have very elusive signs in front of their storefronts that say, like, get lost, come in, get a free cup of coffee or something? We really need an incentive to be in store these days. And while I do believe in retail, there needs to be an added benefit for consumers to want to go to Barnes & Noble. If there was something interesting that Barnes & Noble was doing, I would be there, but it's just not getting to me. So there's some kind of lag in communication, branding, and publicity here. Not that they don't have a great product offering, because I think almost anyone can find a love for books, whatever that looks like for them. So that could be audiobooks, it could be autobiographies, it could be nonfiction, it could be like manga or anime or whatever the case may be. But we really need to bring out that emotion back into Barnes & Noble, because there's something that really warms your heart when you think of that brand. And an enchantment. I found this to be an interesting concept that came from You've Got Mail, and the little shop around the corner was known as like this enchanting bookstore that you would just get lost in and that you had such great memories tied into. In the part of the movie that I always get a little teary-eyed at is the point where Kathleen Kelly has to shut down the bookstore and it's completely empty, and her mom owned it at one point, and there's this visual of her and her mom dancing around, and there's a really emotional component that I think we need to bring back to bookstores and at Barnes & Noble specifically. And we need to see that content. That is one of my key pieces of advice, is that while I think they have a lot of great initiatives, because I had read the Guardian article that was most recently published about this James guy, the CEO, and a lot of the same ideas were adding up, but I'm just not seeing them. So that would be one of my key pieces of advice in terms of product for them. There's also a level of incubation and curation that I see on the forefront for Barnes & Noble. And I know that they're not a publishing house, but I do think that this is going to be the new wave. What's the next Harry Potter or Twilight or It Ends With Us, or these big franchises that end up turning into talent farms and trilogies and movies and all the things? Like, what are those niche books that will blow up? Like, we need to really be nimble and get to the consumer even faster than what Amazon is able to do. And beyond that, it's not just about having that book available at your store or on your .com site, but rather leveraging what you have and your expertise to get the sale converted. So we need to see special sit downs with the author. We need content that we can only see at Barnes & Noble. We need special experiences that you have to go in store for. We cannot be doing the bare minimum and thinking that we can sell books here. Now I'm literally talking as if I work for Barnes & Noble. I do not, but I do see value and potential here that just is not being reached. I really want to see people sitting in Barnes & Noble again, and maybe this does happen, but I do know that the foot traffic has to be down over the past 10 or 15 years, but let people sit there for hours. Of course, make sure it's a safe environment and that people can rest there safely, but I almost want to encourage people to get lost again in a Barnes & Noble and just sit there for hours reading a book, and maybe they get a coffee from the Starbucks, which I believe they still have Starbucks in Barnes & Noble pop-ups, but I'm not entirely sure. Honestly, I should have done a field trip, but I will, and maybe record another episode on my findings. But I'd love to see them have a little bit of a shakeup of their in-store experience. And as part of the article in The Guardian, I had learned that they probably 20 years ago, 15 years ago, had decided to bring in more non-book related areas of the store. So they had puzzles and they had Legos and they had toys and they had other things that their consumer really just wasn't interested in. And they decided to go back into the book business and really go all in with different mediums of books. So they brought back in the bestsellers to the front store tables, and they went all in with that, which I believe was part of James's plan all along, which I agree with. I think that's why people want to go into a Barnes & Noble, which is to have an experience. They want to get lost in a book and find something that they would have never picked up. They want to maybe even meet other people when they're there. They want to talk about the books that they love. They want to discover. And this had reminded me of a project that I did when I was a freshman in college at Northeastern. And Northeastern had this interesting case study project with TJX, which is the TJ Maxx company. And basically they have freshman year students. I don't know if they still do this, but basically they had freshman year students plan and create a project around how TJX could expand their business. And this is kind of what I'm doing here. But Barnes & Noble has to know what they are and what they aren't. So they are not Amazon. They're not able to just plug and chug and make a ton of sales each day. But the sales that they do make, they make loyal customers. And that's what we really need to think about here. I want to see experiences pop up at my local Barnes & Noble store. Like, I want something cool to happen there so I can go back. Whether it's food pop-ups from local vendors within that area, I want these stores to be super strategic. So I had read in the Guardian article that this guy, James, had decided to actually expand their footprint, which is one of my main takeaways and one of the things that I do disagree with, because I don't think it's necessarily about expanding footprint or opening new stores. I think it's actually about having a very tailored and strategic approach into what it is that they do. So Barnes & Noble does not have to be everywhere. Although I think in modern day, we do usually associate Barnes & Nobles with being pretty much everywhere. But I want to see a Barnes & Noble where people are out and about and they're looking for connection. So those cities might look like New York, LA, Boston, Austin, other places where people really want to get out and do things with other people. So whether that be like a special author experience with a Jay Shetty type or a Colleen Hoover, or even more niche authors that are popular or are from that area. Like, I want to see a story. I don't want to just see books, because books don't do it enough. There are so many books and you can't really story tell on just books at large, but rather, okay, let's think about really niche concepts within each market that we can capitalize on. So perhaps this looks like I'm going to take a book out of my own book and one of my favorite authors in Orange County, let's just call it, because that's where my mind goes right now. But I'm a big fan of Kelly LeVeque, who's a functional nutritionist, and I'm sure she'll have another book coming out, but she's had 2 books thus far. And so if Kelly were to come out with a 3rd book, how this would look would be potentially having Kelly going to the bookstore, Barnes & Noble at the Grove, which I believe is still one of their flagships, and have a couple of the vendors maybe be there and be present at her launch and make it an experience, make it something that they have to buy a ticket for, and that the community members of the Be Well by Kelly community want to come to and want to really spend time and soak up all the awesomeness that is at this event. So maybe it's like Goop Kitchen sponsors this event or whatever the case may be, and then she brings out a special guest like Jessica Alba. Whatever the case may be, we need more than just come buy books at Barnes & Noble, because it's not working. It's a little bit out of date, and this is where I actually want to go into their physical branding. So when I think of Barnes & Noble, I think of whatever they showed in You Got Mail and the Fox & Sons example, which is basically like a bootleg version of Barnes & Noble. But Barnes & Noble has a very like old-timey feel to it in a way. It's a little cozy. There's a ton of books, but what I envision is that it's just books. And I'm glad that they've gone back to that product model, because I don't want to buy like puzzles and shit at Barnes & Noble. That just is for somewhere else, and that's really not what Barnes & Noble is known for. So I want Barnes & Noble to keep the original logo. I know that I've seen a more modernized logo. I want to say it was the one that I passed in Marina Del Rey most recently, and I honestly don't think that's the way to go. I think they got to keep it very similar to what they had originally had. I don't think that's where we need to really change things up, but I wouldn't go into the contemporary space. There's something very cold, hard, and capitalistic about Amazon, and Barnes & Noble needs to be the complete antithesis of that. I want to feel like a warm cup of coffee when I walk into a Barnes & Noble. I want it to smell delicious. Maybe you need to take a book out of, what's that hotel chain that starts with a G? I forget, but the hotel chain that has the chocolate chip cookies. Like, what's your signature? Like, you need a memory of the senses when you walk into Barnes & Noble, because when you buy a book on Amazon, sure, you might be very excited about it to receive it in the mail, but there's just nothing like a Saturday, maybe it's rainy, maybe it's a little bit chilly. You find yourself in a Barnes & Noble, you pick up a book, you start reading it, and you just have this really sensorial experience around it. That's what I want from a Barnes & Noble, and I have not had that in many, many years. But could you have different food pop-ups that are in a Barnes & Noble? I recently went to Cha-Cha Matcha in Venice on Abbot Kinney, and I will give Kosas Beauty a shout out and a positive thumbs up on what they did there, because they had done an anniversary push of their Revealer Concealer at Cha-Cha Matcha, and those two consumer targets are exactly the same. So it really was a 1-2 punch. They had custom cup sleeves, they had different postcards with more information about the product. They even had a full gondola of all the shades of their concealer at Cha Cha Matcha, which does not seem to make a ton of sense, but when you think about the clean girls who go on their hot girl walk and they wear maybe a little bit concealer because they want to feel good, and then they get their matcha, it makes so much sense. So maybe in LA, what we could see at a Barnes & Noble, I'm just thinking the Grove because that one's easy to think about, but maybe they have a pop-up by the Yeasty Boys in LA and they have Josh Peck's next book come out or something. Like, super unexpected, super fun, and draws in an entirely new audience. He has a podcast called the Good Guys Podcast with Ben Soffer, celebrity. So I want to see that kind of cool shit happening at a Barnes & Noble, and then I'll be there. But it's got to happen. Otherwise, I'm probably not going to be a repeat customer, and I'm just going to go purchase something on Amazon because it's easier and faster for me. And then maybe in New York, you have a more sophisticated group of Gen Zers. Like, you have a influencer who's launching a new book, and then you bring in Levain Cookies as the key sponsor. Like, that's enticing. That gives me more of a feeling and emotion around wanting to be there than just simply a purchase and a transactional experience. I want something more, and I want to see this happen for Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble back in the day used to be a very fun place, and again, like I said, still holds a nostalgic part of our hearts, and I know a lot of us still have that, but if you're under a certain age, you probably didn't have that with Barnes & Noble. You just don't have any feeling towards them at all. So we need to go a little bit harder here. Like, we need to think about what the next generation of readers really want to see. And I see Barnes & Noble as a place that could look like, and I don't know if it's there right now, but I do think it could be something like a Disneyland or an American Girl store or a Starbucks Reserve if you've ever been to one of those, but it feels so special and so specific to that area. And Disneyland, American Girl stores, and Starbucks Reserve have all done this in the sense that they have localized their different footprints. And Disneyland, American Girl stores, and Starbucks Reserve do not have very many stores around the world, but what they do have, they go all in on. Like, American Girl stores, if you've ever been into one, are absolutely incredible. Like, the amount of money that they must make on a daily basis is insane. They know their audience, and best believe when you have a little girl going in there with one of their parents, probably their mom, like, they will be coming out of the store purchasing more things than they would have thought of, bar none. And if you go into a Starbucks Reserve, I find this to be most interesting for Barnes & Noble because that's really a community style place. People want to hang out there. They want to learn about the coffee. They want to know about it from the experts. And this is where I will go into the in-store experience. And I see the in-store employees as leverage for Barnes & Noble. Again, I haven't been into one in a long time, but if I'm not mistaken, my memory serves me that some employees at Barnes & Noble are into the books and who will chat about it for days on end. And then there's others who are really just there because it's a paycheck. So what I would love to see is a Trader Joe's style employee introduction at Barnes & Noble. How do we get employees at Barnes & Noble that just care so much about books that they want to talk about it all day long? And how do they express what their niche is? And how do you have different constellations of people throughout the store that help guide the consumer into what they want to read? So maybe it's a name tag that says, "Hi, my name is Shelby and I love books that are like Hallmark," or whatever. Whatever the case may be, like, I want those interactions to be happening at Barnes & Noble on a daily basis. And maybe it does happen, but that's not been my experience. And I don't think I hear a ton of people also talk about Barnes & Noble in that way. And if they were to leverage that, that is something that Amazon could never do because there's no one-to-one interaction on Amazon. It's completely personless, which is to their benefit because they don't have to charge the overhead of having employees or having inventory or having rent or anything like that, which works for them. But what Barnes & Noble can do is provide, again, that extra layer of education. As I've learned from my experience being in beauty, the education is so key, and this is going to be also key with Barnes & Noble. Because maybe I go in there and I have literally no idea what I'm looking for, but I want you to help guide me to look at something that maybe I would have never explored before. Now let's go into pricing. So I will say Barnes & Noble is not going to win here. This isn't going to be their biggest piece of leverage, but what they can win on is emotion and loyalty. So if they're able to hone in on this aspect of the feeling that you get when you are hit with an ad from Barnes & Noble, or when you walk into a Barnes & Noble, or when you open the pages of a book, now that's where you can win. I also think another piece of leverage that they have here, which isn't necessarily pricing related, but is rather their investment as a brand into CSR initiatives. When I saw that they had partnered with different universities to, in their words, make education more inclusive, that to me made me feel differently about the brand entirely. And I wonder if it's something along the lines of putting money back into every transaction into the arts in public schools, or whatever the case may be. Like, I want more personification around Barnes & Noble. Like, what does Barnes & Noble care about? Like, who are their people? Are they just doing it for the money like Amazon, or are they really out for a better cause? And I really think that they need to have that come through. Like, tug at the heartstrings. Like, we need you back. And this is a David against Goliath situation, I'm very much aware, and they may never reach the heights of an Amazon, but what they can do is be very nimble and know exactly who they are. And I don't believe their product model is going to win in the e-reader space. I don't know if that's a key mission of theirs, but they're never going to win against the Kindle, and that's just okay. I am glad that they sell them in store, but that's not going to be something that they need to have as one of their big bets. Their big bets is their emotionality and their nostalgic nature of who they are. Like, that's really how they're going to win. I'm going through my list here because I have just so many thoughts. I think partnering with the students as well is something that they can win at. So when I think of where Barnes & Noble might sit, it might be, I know the one most close to me is next to like a Trader Joe's, a Cafe Rio, a REI, and an Old Navy. So who are the people that frequent that area, and what can you offer them in order to even make it into the store? Because I literally don't know the last time I went into a Barnes & Noble. It must have been at least like 5-6 years ago when I was really bored. So I need a reason to go into the store in the first place. So if you were a student specifically, because I think this is where they have a lot of opportunity. If you were a student, because students, what do they need? They need places to study. They like to hang out with their friends. They also like their alone time, and they do want to learn to some extent. So can you offer them a free cup of coffee with every purchase? Like, how do you get these students in the store? I remember Madewell had a student discount, and I always made sure that I made sure that that was part of my purchase every time when I went to Madewell. So that still stands out in my mind from the days when I was a student. Let's go into promotion for Barnes & Noble. And this is going to sound similar to the first bucket within product, but how does Barnes & Noble localize in a way that feels really exciting? I think that having 600 stores in the US is great, and they probably do have more foot traffic and more coverage around the US because of it. But how do you actually do more with less? So this is an 80-20 analysis. It's also winning where there are key markets and where they can build stories. Reading a book is all about learning more about a story or about a thesis, and Barnes & Noble has lost the plot, let's be honest. I'm going to pull a page from the TikTok people. I feel like there's a lot of thoughts on there along those lines, but Barnes & Noble, if they come back to their roots, can win in their specific function. So I have some ideas similar to the way that Glossier or Starbucks has done it, but they have specific product at specific locations around the country and around the world even that are only found at those specific storefronts. So at Glossier, they have different bags, makeup bags that they have, and different trinkets and such that you can buy that are only found at their stores at specific locations. So they have like an Atlanta colorway and an LA colorway, and that's kind of part of the treasure hunt of being at a Glossier. Their people at the different storefronts as well embody the spirit of that city. And, in Boston, they probably act a bit different than they would in Chicago and in New York. And there's like that special identity within each storefront around the country, which I find to be really intriguing and really interesting. Once I learned about Glossier's strategy here, that was something I wanted to dive deeper into as a person, because I want to go and see what Glossier has when it can only be sold in one area. Unfortunately, part of expansion and capitalism is that you can basically buy anything you want anytime, anywhere. And when there's an exclusivity involved in product, there's demand and there's hype. And I do think Barnes & Noble can get there eventually. Starbucks does the same thing. I know my aunt buys the mugs at Starbucks that say Chicago and Atlanta and Austin and whatever. And it's a collector's item of sorts. So I'm sure that people go to those specific locations just wanting something, a piece of where they were as a souvenir. This is something that Barnes & Noble can certainly do, and certainly tailor their approach with wherever they are. So I'd love to see them actually reduce their door count and specifically target certain markets within the U.S. where they know they can win and where they can create stories. So perhaps this looks like trade marketing individuals that work on a region and who go really deep into creating stories around that specific region. So if you're in Austin, maybe you have, I just came up with this idea on the fly, but maybe if Matthew McConaughey were to come out with a new book, best believe you should be having him there. You should have an extra excerpt and Q&A and special experience for those people who made it over to Barnes & Noble in Austin to see Matthew McConaughey in his next book, whatever it's going to be after Green Lights. I think he also wrote a children's novel as well. Another tip here around localization is to partner with other brands that quote unquote get it, like Bumble, Camber, BetterHelp, AG1, more D2C style brands that tend to win with Gen Z audiences. I think could be an interesting idea for Barnes & Noble to partner with. There are a ton of different events around LA and New York. Specifically, I mentioned Camber, which is an app that basically has publicizes different experiences around the city and often partners with other brands. So they have partnered with Bumble before on walks out in Santa Monica, things like that. So how do you have a digital and modern brand like a Bumble partner with a legacy brand that has been around for 30, 40 years like Barnes & Noble? How do you bring in those audiences and talk about different things that interest them beyond just, I want a book at a cheap price and I want to get it tomorrow? We need more levers to pull. Another promotion tactic needs to be early leads. So how do you get early leads at a Barnes & Noble and then also build the 360 around it to have that destination land at Barnes & Noble before anywhere else? Target used to do this, and I don't know if that's something that they necessarily do anymore, but basically what they would do was have special promotions with an artist. So I believe Taylor Swift still does this at Target, interestingly enough. It might be a little bit outdated, but Taylor Swift had a special red album only at Target. So while I think that might be slightly outdated, I think there's a way to be able to do it that will build incentives to get people in the store, and even ahead of the time when the book officially launches nationally. So we want to see Barnes & Noble be the flagship in partnership with all the key authors and also in more niche audiences as well, because if you're able to build influence with more niche audiences, so maybe that's specifically biohacking or it's specifically candle making. I have no idea. I'm just talking out loud here. But if you're able to build those niche audiences, then you can scale it at an even bigger level. So this can build community. How do you get people to be talking about Barnes & Noble again? Because I don't remember the last time I had a conversation with one of my friends and family about Barnes & Noble. It wasn't until I just had this random idea that I had thought about it. I want Barnes & Noble to be back in the action over Amazon. What's the experience of buying a book these days, and how can we augment that experience? Because there's been a level of enchantment, I'll go back to our original example, that has been taken out of the book buying experience. And Barnes & Noble can do that. They just haven't effectively done it just yet. what I would say to this as well is to act like a local bookstore at a bigger scale. So get scrappy, like have regional pushes on different books and different authors that are localized in that area, or maybe there's a specific sub segment of people who are interested in that topic, like if it's Hollywood, like it's film, or if it's in Silicon Valley, maybe it's the biohacking market, whatever the case may be. Like get scrappy and get to know your audience, like get to know the trends that are happening in that area and offer different experiences related to that as well. Okay, now this is the final P, and that is distribution. And like I mentioned before, Barnes & Noble currently has over 600 in-store brick and mortar footprints in the US, which is rather large. But what I would recommend that they do is take the top 20% of the doors, so the 20% of the doors that are the most productive, and amplify the messaging within those stores. So create a specific product marketing approach to each of those 20% of the doors. So in Austin, your strategy is different than in New York, LA, Boston, San Francisco. You have a specific person in mind when you're speaking in all of those different areas. You also need to have a true flagship strategy here, and I know that the Grove, I believe, has been maybe positioned as one because they always have different speaker opportunities there, but how do you even better amplify that? Because it seems like it only reaches a certain amount of people who maybe follow that author on social media, but how do you make it an even bigger and better experience? Like how do you make it that moment that really brings emotion out of people that you have to go to whenever you're in whatever city? It's like an Italy almost. If you've been to an Italy, they have a very large footprint in a select amount of cities, but they also have specific products that are targeted to that area in particular. So I'd say Italy is another good comp for Barnes & Noble too. Certainly Barnes & Noble needs to have an online presence, no doubt about it. People are still buying books at a rapid rate online. However, they need to know this is not going to be where they win. And if they are going to sell online, they need to add other experiences that help the consumer get to that point of conversion. So how do they curate lists specifically for those consumers that is better than anywhere else on the web? Goodreads, like I said, is owned by Amazon, unfortunately, and Amazon also owns Audible, so they need to think really differently. It needs to be out of the box. They need to take risks in order to continue to grow. They also need to partner with different tastemakers. So when I say the word author, that might mean traditional authors who write fiction books or nonfiction books, but even just tastemakers in different industries. They need to partner with them to invite their audience into a Barnes & Noble, which if it's a younger subsegment of people, it might be people who have never shopped at Barnes & Noble, not even once in their life. And if it's an older group of people, then maybe they get reintroduced into the brand and then hopefully they come back as a loyal consumer in the future. But it's going to take time to get there. Okay, those are all the ideas that I have jotted down. I'm sure there will be more that come to me even after this. Let's see how long I've been recording. 50 minutes. Okay, that's been a long time. That's, I think, the longest recording I've ever done. And the next time I do this, I'm sure it'll be even better. But I had so many ideas for Barnes & Noble, and I want to see them come back with a rebrand that's bigger and better than ever. Quite frankly, they're not there yet, but I see that they have the ideas and the inklings that are there. And there's so much talk around Amazon and why it may be ethical to shop at Amazon, why it might not be ethical to shop at Amazon, but we need to bring back book buying as a spiritual experience. I remember when I was a really little girl, yes, going into Barnes & Nobles, but even more than that, going into libraries with my grandmother when I would go and visit her, which was all the time. And we would go into the library, and that was one of the best experiences that I had from my childhood that I always reflect really fondly on, which was going into a library, getting lost, spending a ton of time there, and feeling like my nervous system was rested. How do we get consumers to want to do that again? And also, how do we get them to make a bookstore like Barnes & Noble kind of their playground? I think that the You've Got Mail movie actually did that well. looking at Fox and Sons, which was like the fake Barnes and Noble, they had a couple of scenes of children diving into books and people grabbing coffee, and the way that, interestingly enough, Dave Chappelle was also in that movie. That's kind of a random fact about it. But yeah, Dave Chappelle was in that movie, and he called Fox and Sons a piazza or something like that. I thought that was so interesting. I was like, yeah, I guess you're right. We need to think about retail design in a completely different way when it comes to Barnes & Noble. Like, how do you have that, if we're talking about a piazza, like, how do you have that central quadrant that is where everyone goes? Like, what's the central focal point? I think that, again, I haven't been, unfortunately, into a Barnes & Noble in a long time, but what I think about it is that there's not necessarily something when I walk into it that anchors me. What anchors you is generally the best-selling books in the front, which, yes, I'm sure gets a ton of traction, but like, what's that center focal point that makes me want to go towards that area? Is it like fresh baguettes baking in the back, or chocolate chip cookies, or a cup of espresso, or like, what is it? Like, what's going to draw me in? Because as it stands now, it's just same old, and we've got to bring this brand into the modern age. I'm curious to see if Barnes & Noble will take any of this advice. I'm sure they will not, but I thought I would go ahead and publish it anyways. It's the first of many, so if you have any other ideas of brands that you'd like me to cover, I'd be more than happy to. But I thought I would start here. It's definitely a bold one because I'm sure most people would say that Barnes & Noble has no shot against Amazon, but I actually see a white space for them. And this James guy, James Daunt is his name, seems really interesting. And he has plans, which I'm sure have not been able to be fully executed because of COVID. He had started in 2019. But I feel like he's kind of the man for the job. But if I may, I have an additional piece of advice, and that is that he has his vision as a CEO. But I would say he needs to really look at external partnerships in order to grow the business. They know that they sell books and they are able to do that well, but perhaps they need to bring in a agency that has turned around brands like Barnes & Noble in the past. They really need a refresh really bad because Book Talk seems to be continuing on more than ever and is truly part of our everyday language and conversation in today's day. And unfortunately, Barnes & Noble has not been part of that conversation. And I think they could be. Because I'm sure even just speaking about this topic has incited some idea in you as the consumer about the brand that was probably forgotten for many, many years, like myself. Like I said, I don't think I've been into a store for like a good 5 or 6 years because I really haven't had a reason. But there are certainly days where I want to feel that excitement and that enchantment, and I go to local bookstores, which I still highly recommend. However, I think Barnes & Noble can take the page out of the smaller bookstores and bring back in that excitement and uniqueness that it was once known and loved for. It's become such a corporate company, and I think they can still harness some of the mom and pop features that they once had, I'm sure, at one point. So, with that said and done, it's been 55 minutes, which I believe is the longest podcast recording that I've done. And it's the first one that I've done live recording myself as well on Riverside, which has been new and different. I did my case study today, which was a lot of information. And next time I'm sure it'll be even better. But I'm so excited to dive into other topics, different industries, different brands, whatnot. So feel free to shoot me an email over at seeingbetterpod@gmail.com if you have any ideas, feedback, recommendations. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please like it, subscribe, and share it with a friend. And I hope you all have an amazing week, and I hope you'll be seeing better in the next episode. Thank you.